Before the headlines, before the hot takes, before the label gets louder than the player, ask yourself this. How does a black woman athlete become a problem before the public ever hears her speak? Before we hear her side, before we hear the frustration that comes from moving through a league where every emotion is surveilled, every reaction is archived, and every mistake is permanently bookmarked. At what point does a reputation become more powerful than reality? Because in professional sports, language doesn't just describe, it decides. Labels travel faster than facts. Once a player is branded difficult, toxic, or a locker room issue, the system no longer has to explain itself. Coaches don't have to contextualize, front offices don't have to account, media doesn't have to investigate. The label becomes the explanation. And for black women, those labels don't land neutral. They're loaded with centuries of expectations about tone, obedience, gratitude, and silence. Step outside that narrow lane and the story gets written without you, about you, and against you. So this series isn't about gossip. It's about power. It's about control. It's about what happens when talent is undeniable, but comfort is not. Welcome to CessTalksSports BWISE PoliSports Tea Time, where we don't just talk about what happens on the court. We break down who benefits from the narrative behind it, where sports, politics, race, gender, and media collide, and where flattened headlines get unpacked with intention. This is Blackball But Paid, the Chennedy Carter question, a series about talent, containment, and what happens when a black woman refuses to disappear quietly. Because sometimes the loudest thing an athlete can do isn't what she says, but simply continuing to exist outside the system that tried to erase her. So let's start where the story actually begins, not with controversy, but with promise. And to help me break this all the way down, I'm joined by my co-host, Political Lil, here to pull apart the narratives, expose the power dynamics, and challenge the stories we've been told to accept without question. How does a player get sentenced before she speaks? Before context, before receipts, before her truth hits air. When does a label outrank reality? Because in sports, branding travels faster than evidence. Difficult, toxic, locker room issue. Once that stamp lands, the system stops explaining. Coaches don't have to justify minutes. Front offices don't have to own mistakes. Media doesn't have to do reporting. The label becomes the whole case file. And for black women, the label isn't neutral, it's coded. Tone gets policed, emotion gets criminalized, boundaries get reframed as attitude, confidence gets rewritten as threat. So the question isn't just how labels appear, it's who profits when they stick. Because once the public accepts the label, the only thing they ask is, why couldn't she handle it? Not was it fair, not who created it, not who needed her quiet. So let's start with the moment the story got rewritten. When did Chennedy Carter become a problem instead of a prospect? Because the origin story wasn't chaos, it was electricity. Drafted top 4 in 2020, explosive guard, instant offense, game-breaking speed. Then the language changed. Not bucket, not impact, not upside. Fit, chemistry, attitude. That shift matters because fit is often code for comfort, and comfort is what institutions protect. Now here's the twist that makes this series necessary. Chennedy may be outside the WNBA right now, but she's not out of the game. She's playing overseas, she's earning, she's continuing. And if a player can function, produce, and thrive elsewhere, we have to ask the question the system avoids. Was the problem ever the player or the environment that needed her smaller? Lil, set the frame.
Let me be clear from the start. This is not a defense campaign. This is not about declaring Chennedy Carter innocent or flawless. This is about examining how narratives are constructed, who constructs them, and why certain players are given grace while others are given exile. What we're interrogating here is the machinery, how moments get magnified, how context gets stripped away, how a single incident can be transformed into a character profile, and how once that profile exists, it becomes nearly impossible for a player, especially a black woman, to outplay it. So as we move forward, we're not asking you to pick a side. We're asking you to think critically about how sides are assigned in the first place and what it costs when a story becomes more important than the truth. And with that framing in place, let's take it back to the beginning, because to understand how the label sticks, we have to understand how the story starts. Back to you, Auntie Seth.
Let's run the timeline clean. No commentary, no character reads, no shortcuts. 2020, Chennedy Carter entered the dub and was at the number 4 pick to Atlanta. She's drafted for scoring, and the production translates immediately. She isn't a long-term project. She's an instant offense guard who looks pro-ready from day one. But the Atlanta environment is unstable. Ownership turmoil, front office changes, coaching uncertainty. That matters. Guards develop inside structure, and structure was shifting constantly. Next stop, Los Angeles, another franchise in transition. New voices, new systems, new expectations. A team searching for identity after an era of dominance. That kind of instability doesn't just change schemes, it changes roles, rotations, and how players are evaluated week to week. This Chicago, and instability doesn't stop. Coaching changes, a leadership reset, a directional pivot. Teresa Weatherspoon is hired, then removed. Roster priorities shift, the target moves again. And when there's no stability, fit becomes the measuring stick, not just performance, alignment with the constantly changing environment. In that kind of league reality, the player absorbs the turbulence, especially the one who won't pretend the target isn't moving.
And this is where the narrative starts to crack under scrutiny. Because despite all the labels that have followed Chennedy Carter, there is no formal disciplinary record attached to her name in the WNBA. No league suspension history, no fines for conduct, no documented violations that would normally justify the kind of professional exile people imply. That absence matters because in professional sports, when behavior truly crosses the line, it's recorded, it's enforced, it's public. But what we're dealing with here is not documented misconduct, it's perception. And perception, especially when shaped by media, shorthand, and organizational silence, can be far more damaging than any official penalty. Now look at what happens once Chennedy leaves the WNBA. She plays overseas. She continues her career in professional leagues around the world. And suddenly the chaos disappears. No reports of locker room issues, no public clashes, no disciplinary concerns, just basketball and by all accounts, success. That contrast forces an uncomfortable question. If the problem doesn't follow her, was it ever really her? So as we move into the next segment, we have to sit with that contradiction because when instability surrounds the player, but order appears everywhere else, the story we've been told starts to feel incomplete. And that brings us directly into segment 2, where we're going to examine how language and labeling steps in to fill the gap. Back to you, Auntie Seth.
Hey, Lil, let's talk language, because in pro sports, words don't just describe reality, they manufacture it. 2 labels have followed Chennedy Carter harder than any box score. Locker room cancer, problem child. Neither is neutral, neither is about basketball, both are about control. Locker room cancer is a career-ending stamp. It frames a person as contamination, something that spreads, something that must be cut out. Once that word lands, conversation stops. No context, no questions, no shared responsibility, just removal as the solution. Problem child is different poison. It turns disagreement into immaturity and boundaries into bad behavior. It shifts accountability away from organizations and onto character. Not what happened, but what's wrong with her? And the real danger is the vagueness. These labels aren't defined. They aren't substantiated. They aren't challenged. They live in the space between rumor and reputation. Solid enough to stick, slippery enough to avoid liability. And once they attach to a Black woman, they become hard to outrun. Not because they're proven, because they're familiar.
These words end careers because they function as shortcuts for decision makers. Front offices don't need to watch film. Coaches don't need to ask questions. Other teams don't need to do their own evaluation. The label does the labor. It becomes a warning label. Handle with caution. High risk. Not worth the trouble. And here's where the double standard shows up clearly. Some players get coached through conflict. They're described as intense, competitive, or learning how to lead. Others get labeled as problems and removed from the equation entirely. The differences in behavior is who is perceived as worth the investment. Black women in particular are far more likely to be labeled than developed. Their frustration is read as defiance. Their confidence is read as arrogance. Their silence is read as attitude. And once that narrative forms, there's no redemption arc, only distance. So now that we understand how language operates as a form of exile, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who benefits from these labels and what purpose do they serve? That's where we're headed next. Back to you, Auntie Seth.
Facts, Leo. Let's talk about the moment people treat like a before and after. The Chennedy Carter Caitlin Clark incident. Because that hip check didn't stay a foul, it got turned into a symbol. And once something becomes symbolic, facts stop leading. Feelings do. What gets erased first is context. That sequence didn't start with the hip check. That was the contact before the there was contact before the contact. Took an elbow to the head that went uncalled, and the possession unfolded like physical basketball often does in this league. But the whistle didn't drive the story. The narrative did. The clip got cut out of game flow and replayed like a character test. Not what happened, but what does this say about her? And that's the shift. One play becomes proof of personality. A moment becomes a moral verdict. Once that happens, the player stops being evaluated as an athlete. She gets managed as a liability.
The media framing did the rest of the work. Carter was cast as the aggressor. Clark was positioned as the victim, the media darling, the face of the league's next era. And once those roles were assigned, the story kind of wrote itself. Nuance disappeared, context disappeared, history disappeared. What's striking is how familiar this pattern is. On-court incidents happen every season. Hard fouls, retaliation, missed calls. These are part of competitive basketball. But very few players see those moments follow them into off-season narrative, contract decisions, and career-defining reputation. That long-term character assassination is selective. And that's the key insight here. That moment wasn't about a foul. It was about who the league protects and who absorbs the backlash. Some players are shielded, rehabilitated, and humanized. Others are exposed, amplified, and discarded. The difference isn't the contact, it's the culture and economic value assigned to those bodies involved. So once that framing locks in, the question shifts from what happened to what happens next. Because labels don't exist for no reason. They serve someone. And that takes us directly into segment 3. Who benefits from the label? Back to you, Auntie Seth.
When a player gets labeled the problem, the first winners are the organization. Labels erase accountability. Instead of explaining coaching turnover, leadership failures, or broken communication, the story gets rerouted to fit. The issue becomes personal, not structural. And once it's personal, the organization disappears into the background. Not ownership of instability, no ownership of instability, no responsibility for dysfunction. That label becomes especially useful during chaos, front office shakeups, coaching changes, shift in direction. Conflict becomes inevitable in that environment, but teams don't name instability, they individualize it. It's easier to say she didn't work out than admit we didn't build anything stable. The system fails quietly while the player takes the hit. Media benefits too. Complexity doesn't sell like a villain does. Nuance doesn't trend, labels do. Once a player is reduced to a headline, the coverage rarely circles back to fairness. It circles back to clicks.
Fans benefit from the label too, because it offers clarity without effort. Sports fandom thrives on heroes and villains, and labels do the emotional labor of sorting people into those roles. Once a player is marked as the problem, fans don't have to wrestle with discomfort, bias, or systemic failure. They just react. Easy villains also protect fans from questioning their own assumptions. If a player is the issue, then the league is still merit-based, still fair, still functional. There's no need to ask why certain athletes get second chances while others don't, or why similar behavior produces wildly different consequences. So when we ask who benefits from the label, the answer is layered. Teams escape scrutiny, media gains clicks, and fans get a simple story. The only one who doesn't benefit is the player, whose career becomes collateral damage in a system that values control over complexity. And once we understand who benefits from the label, we're left with the final question of this episode. What does it cost? Because labels don't just end conversations, they shape futures. Let's bring it on home. Back to you, Seth.
As we close episode 1, let's be clear about what just happened here. This was never a trial of Chennedy Carter. This was an examination of the system. We stripped the story down to the timeline. No spin, no adjectives, no shortcuts. We interrogated the language that removes players before they're ever understood. And we unpacked how one moment pulled out of context and endlessly replayed stopped being a basketball play and started being treated like a character verdict. What this episode exposes is how fast institutions pivot from responsibility to removal, how instability, weak leadership, and organizational failure get buried under words like culture and fit, and how Black women are routinely expected to absorb that collapse, silently, professionally, and without resistance. So no, this isn't about whether Chennedy Carter is flawless. That's not the standard being applied here. The real question, the one we sit with moving forward, is this. When organizations fail, why are players the ones forced to carry the blame?
And this is exactly why advocacy matters. Because when there's no pushback, narratives harden into policies. Decisions get justified long after the facts stop supporting them. Black women athletes are punished more harshly for longer periods of time, and often for reasons that don't align with the actual incident being cited. Holding organizations accountable means asking the uncomfortable question. Why was this behavioral label unfixable? Why wasn't coaching, mediation, or development offered? Why do similar moments produce vastly different outcomes depending on who the player is? This isn't about favoritism. It's about fairness. And if we don't challenge false flag narratives when they're applied to Black women, we allow the system to continue operating without consequences. That's why we're asking fans, educators, and advocates to join us through the Respect Her Game advocacy group at www.respecthergame.online. Help us push back against distorted narratives and demand accountability where it's overdue. And coming up next, we're going to take a deeper dive into what happened after the label sticks. In episode 2, the incident that became a sentence, we're going to ask the core question here. How does one moment become a lifetime judgment?
Absolutely. And as you sit with this episode, hold these questions. Why are fans so often blocked from seeing Chennedy Carter's greatness as pure basketball? What does the league lose when elite Black women get turned into warnings instead of winners? Because reducing talent to a cautionary tale doesn't just harm the player, it shrinks the game. This series is part of a larger 2026 push toward fan advocacy and real protection. If you care about the WNBA's future, equity, and truth, you're already in this conversation. So move like it. Challenge the narratives. Demand accountability from the systems profiting off Black women's labor. Remember, sports are never just about the games we play, but the stories we tell and the systems we expose. This is Sess, your favorite auntie with Uncle Tendencies and Political Lil. Always sipping the truth and spilling the tea. Y'all stay tuned. Talk soon. We out. Before